The night was thick and quiet, stretching out over the Hinterkaifeck farm like a dark shroud. The house, a lonely silhouette against the vast expanse of the Bavarian countryside, stood in complete isolation. It was the kind of place one could get lost in, not just physically, but mentally, as if the land itself conspired to erase any memory of its inhabitants. The forest surrounding the farm was dense and ancient, a labyrinth of twisted trees that reached toward the sky, blocking out the stars. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and earth, the kind of scent that lingers in the nose long after it has been breathed in. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch of the family, was not a man given to superstition, but lately he had felt something dark settling over the farm. A presence that had crept into the edges of his mind like a whisper, just beyond the reach of hearing. It began with the small things. The way the doors would creak open on their own at night, the flickering of the candlelight in the parlor when no draft had passed through. At first he dismissed it. The house was old after all. Old houses have their quirks, their creaks and groans. But then there were the footsteps. The sound of footsteps in the attic above him, heavy and deliberate. He had checked, of course, climbed up to the attic with the faint light of a lantern in his hand. Nothing. The room was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was waiting in the dark corners of the house. But it was a feeling he couldn't quite explain, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Though he never spoke of it to his wife Cecilia or their daughter Victoria, Cecilia had noticed the change in Andreas too. He had grown quieter, more distant, as though the shadows were stealing parts of him. She had caught him staring out the window. Late at night, his eyes lost in the darkened landscape, as if he were listening for something that only he could hear. The unease in the house had begun to affect her as well. She started to hear the strange noises, footsteps in the hall, whispers in the wind, and found herself peering into the dark, half expecting to see someone standing there watching her. Victoria, their daughter, was different still. She had always been a sensitive child, quick to feel the moods of others, but lately she seemed unnaturally quiet. Her large brown eyes clouded with an unease that no one could explain. She had started to wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the dark corners of her room, her face pale with fear. Sometimes she would speak in her sleep, her voice trembling with words that didn't make sense. "Don't let it in," she would whisper in the dark. "It's coming." At first, Cecilia thought it was just a phase, something the child would grow out of. But then came the night when Victoria screamed in terror, waking the entire house with a cry that sent chills down their spines. She had seen something, she said. A man standing at the foot of her bed, his face hidden in the shadows. She had been certain he was real, but when they searched the room, there was no one there. Victoria's fear grew as the days passed, and the unease in the house seemed to fester. The once cozy rooms now felt cold and empty, as though the walls themselves were closing in. But it wasn't just the house, it was the land. There was something about the land that made them uneasy, a quiet, unsettling feeling that lingered long after they had closed the door behind them and locked it for the night. Then on the morning of March 31st, Andreas went missing. Cecilia had risen early, as she always did, to start the fire in the hearth and prepare breakfast for the family. But when she went to wake her husband, he was nowhere to be found. His bed was empty, the covers disturbed, as though he had gotten up in the night, but there was no sign of where he had gone. The door to the barn was ajar, and the wind howled through the cracks in the wood. She called out to him, but there was no answer. Panic set in. She sent Victoria to check the fields while she searched the house. There was no sign of him anywhere, not in the barn, not in the cellar, not in the woods. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Cecilia's anxiety deepened. She knew something was wrong. Something had happened to Andreas. But what had he left? Had he been taken? The farm, once familiar and safe, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her. Victoria, her eyes wide with fear, returned from the woods. She had found no trace of her father, only the unnerving sense that something had been watching her from the trees. That evening, as the sun set, the atmosphere in the house grew thick with tension. The strange noises, once dismissed as the quirks of an old house, were no longer easily ignored. The wind seemed to carry something with it, an unnerving whisper that made the hairs on the back of Cecilia's neck prickle. The walls groaned as if the house itself was alive, groaning under the weight of some terrible secret. Cecilia sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her thoughts racing. Where was Andreas? And why did it feel like the very earth beneath her feet was shifting, as if the land itself was moving, breathing, waiting? She glanced up at Victoria, who sat in the corner of the room, her eyes blank, staring into nothing. The girl hadn't spoken in hours, and Cecilia's heart ached for her. Victoria, Cecilia said softly, her voice trembling, "Where do you think he's gone?" But the girl didn't answer. Instead, she stood and walked toward the door, her feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The door swung open, creaking on its hinges, as if it too were hesitant to let her pass. Victoria stepped outside into the cold night, her figure disappearing into the shadows. Cecilia followed, her heart racing as she tried to catch up. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the land. It was then that Cecilia saw it, the faintest outline of something moving among the trees. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the forest. Victoria seemed to see it too, for she stopped in her tracks, her face drained of color. "It's here," she whispered. Before Cecilia could speak, before she could ask what she meant, the figure stepped forward, its form solidifying in the moonlight. The cold air seemed to freeze around it, the wind dying as if afraid to disturb its presence. Cecilia felt a shiver run down her spine. The figure was not human. It was something darker, something older. And as it stepped toward them, its eyes locked onto theirs, and for the first time since she could remember, Cecilia felt truly afraid. The figure moved closer, its tall, slender form stepping out from the shadows of the trees, its feet making no sound on the soft earth. Cecilia's breath caught in her throat. The moonlight illuminated the creature's face, or what should have been a face, but the sight sent a wave of nausea through her. The features were distorted, its skin pale, almost as if drained of color, and its eyes dark and hollow, glinted with an unnatural malice. Victoria remained frozen, staring at the figure with wide eyes, her lips parted in a silent, breathless gasp. The wind had ceased altogether, leaving the world in a suffocating silence. The only sound was the heavy pounding of Cecilia's heart as she instinctively reached for her daughter. her hand trembling as she grabbed Victoria's arm. "We need to go inside," Cecilia whispered, her voice barely audible. She wanted to run to flee, but her feet felt as if they had sunk into the ground, as if the earth itself had claimed her, binding her to the spot. But Victoria didn't move. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward her mother, her expression blank, as if she were no longer fully present in the world. "It's not going to let us go," she murmured, her voice so soft, so distant that it barely carried in the dead air. "It's already inside." Cecilia felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, her blood turning cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, but Victoria didn't respond. She stood there staring at the figure, as though hypnotized, as if some invisible force were pulling her toward it. The figure moved again, slow and deliberate, its eyes never leaving theirs. As it came closer, Cecilia noticed a strange, unsettling detail. It was barefoot, its long limbs impossibly thin, like a twig bent in the wind. Its body seemed to shimmer, shifting slightly in the pale moonlight, as though it were made of mist rather than flesh. And when it spoke, its voice was not human. It was the sound of rustling leaves, the faint whisper of wind passing through hollow trees. "You cannot escape," it said, the words slipping through the air like a cold breeze, an echo that made Cecilia's stomach churn. "This land is mine." Victoria's hand, cold as ice, brushed against her mother's. "It has always been here," she said, her voice almost lost in the night. "We are just the latest to be its prisoners." The words made no sense yet. In that moment, Cecilia knew. She knew the truth that she had tried so desperately to deny. The house, the farm, the land, it was not just a place. It was something alive, something ancient, and it had waited for them to come. They were nothing but guests to its darkness. Visitors trapped in a house that was far older than they could comprehend. The figure stretched out a long, bony hand toward Victoria, its fingers curling in a grotesque, beckoning motion. "Come," it whispered, and the sound of its voice felt like a heavy weight on Cecilia's chest. Victoria's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment she seemed to return to herself. She looked at her mother, her face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something more unsettling. "It's too late," she said quietly. "It's already here." Cecilia's heart pounded in her chest. She had to protect her daughter. But how could she? How could anyone fight something that was older than time itself? Something that had waited in the darkness of the forest, in the silence of the house, watching and listening for so long. A shrill, eerie sound pierced the stillness. The sound of a door opening, followed by the unmistakable creak of old wood. Cecilia spun around, her breath caught in her throat as the house loomed behind them, its windows black and hollow. No one was inside. The house had been abandoned, but the door, she hadn't left it open. The wind hadn't blown it open either. Someone or something had opened it from the inside. She felt the pull of the house, as if the building itself was reaching out, calling them in, pulling them toward its heart, its dark center. Victoria seemed to sense it too. Her body tensed, and she jerked her arm from her mother's grasp, stepping forward toward the house, her footsteps soft but determined. "I have to go back," she whispered, her voice distant and strange. "It's waiting for me." No. Cecilia gasped, rushing forward, but before she could reach her daughter, a force gripped her, something invisible, a weight that pressed down on her chest. She stumbled, gasping for breath, as if the very air around her had become thick, suffocating. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The figure, still standing in the moonlight, tilted its head to one side. Its hollow eyes locked onto Cecilia with an intensity that felt like it was peeling her soul apart, layer by layer. "She belongs to us now," it said in that same rustling, windswept voice. "You all do." The ground beneath Cecilia's feet began to shift, as if the earth itself were rearranging, shifting, and pulling her into the depths. She could feel the land vibrating, a low hum that seemed to come from deep within the soil, as if something beneath them was waking, stretching its limbs after a long slumber. Desperation surged through Cecilia. She had to act. She had to save her daughter. But the world around her was slipping away, the edges of her vision growing dim, her body feeling as though it were becoming part of the land itself. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she forced herself forward, grabbing Victoria's arm just as her daughter stepped toward the door of the house. "We have to leave," Cecilia pleaded, her voice cracking with fear. "We can't stay here. We have to leave now before it's too late." But Victoria only looked at her with those hollow, unblinking eyes, her face pale and cold. "It's already too late," she whispered. "It has always been too late." The figure behind them spoke again, its voice like a whisper on the wind, cold and inevitable. "You cannot escape us," it said. "You belong to us. All of you. Forever." Cecilia's heart broke as she realized the truth. There was no escaping the Hinterkaifeck farm, no running from its dark grip. It had claimed them. They were already lost. With a final desperate cry, Cecilia turned to face the house, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the night, followed by a silence so deep it felt as if the world had come to an end. And then the shadows consumed them. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter, a low, hollow echo that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had waited for them all along, something that would never let them go. In the end, the house stood still, its walls closing in on itself, its secrets buried in the soil beneath it. And the land that had waited for so long, was silent once more. Story 2. The Villisca Axe Murders. The small town of Villisca, Iowa, sat in the vast expanse of rolling farmlands, its streets narrow and quiet, lined with modest houses that seemed to fade into the landscape. On any given day, the soft hum of life carried over the town, a steady rhythm of roosters, crowing children playing in the streets, the shuffle of boots across dirt roads. But the night was different. The night brought with it a strange, almost unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that presses against the ears, filling the mind with uneasy thoughts. The Moore family had lived in a white house at the corner of 2nd and Elm Streets for years. It was an old house built in the late 1800s, with large windows and a wide front porch that creaked under the weight of time. Inside, the floors were worn from years of use, the wallpaper faded, but there was a sense of warmth in the home. It had seen the lives of parents and children, laughter and tears, day after day, year after year. The Moore family consisted of Joe and Sarah, both in their mid-30s, their children Lena, the eldest at 12, and the younger siblings Ina, who was 8, and Boyd, the youngest at 5. The family was well liked in the town, known for their kindness and their work ethic. They attended church regularly always present for Sunday services and were involved in the community. They were the sort of family that represented the ideal small-town life, wholesome, simple, and grounded in tradition. But the night of June 9th, 1912 would break that ideal. It would shatter the serenity of Villisca and stain its history with a tragedy so disturbing that the town would never be the same. That evening, the Moore family had returned home after a church service. They had invited two young friends over for the night, the Stillinger sisters, who were just a few years younger than Lena. The girls had spent the evening at church, sitting together, chatting in quiet voices during the service. The evening was warm, with a light breeze, and the sounds of the town seemed to fade away as the Moore family made their way into their home. The house was dark when they entered as usual. The curtains drawn, the quiet that enveloped the house felt familiar. They settled in for the night. The children were tucked into their beds. Each room in the house silent, but for the sound of the occasional creaking floorboard. Sarah, the mother, was the last to retire for the night, lingering over the dinner dishes, the quiet hum of her own thoughts filling the space. Her husband Joe had already gone to bed, and the children had followed shortly after. The house was bathed in the soft light of the oil lamps, the flickering flame casting long shadows across the walls. Then, just before midnight, the silence was broken. A figure moved through the darkness. No sound of footsteps, no creaking of floorboards, just the shift of the air as something or someone slipped into the house. The figure, tall and silent, moved with careful precision, gliding through the rooms as though they knew the layout as well as anyone who had lived there. They passed through the narrow hallways, slipping into the bedrooms one by one. First, they entered the parents' room. Joe Moore lay in his bed, sleeping soundly, his face soft with the calm of sleep. But the figure was prepared. The heavy axe raised high in the air and came down in one swift motion, silencing Joe's breath in an instant. A single blow, clean and efficient, before the figure moved to the next room. The rest of the family too met their end in the same brutal way. Each blow delivered with chilling precision, each victim falling to the floor, their bodies left in the unnatural stillness of death. The children did not wake. They did not cry out for their parents, did not ask questions or scream. They died in their sleep as the axe struck them one by one. The two young Stillinger girls were killed in the same manner, their faces frozen in expressions of fear, their bodies left like broken dolls in the dark corners of the house. Each blow was quick, calculated, each victim caught in the grasp of a merciless killer who moved through the house as if they were a shadow unseen and untouchable. The morning light found the house as it always was, silent, calm, almost peaceful. The town went about its business, unaware that inside that house the Moore family, along with the Stillinger girls, were dead. It wasn't until late in the morning that the house was discovered. The neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed that the curtains in the window of the Moore home had not been drawn back, as was their habit. She thought it odd that the family hadn't risen for breakfast, that the house was so eerily quiet. Her suspicions grew as she knocked on the door, calling out to the family, but receiving no answer. She peeked through a crack in the door, but still she saw nothing. Then she tried the door itself, and to her shock, it opened. Inside, the smell of death hit her immediately, a heavy, sickly scent that filled the air. She gasped and stumbled backward, but her feet carried her inside, compelled by a force she could not understand. What she found inside was beyond anything she could have imagined. The house was a scene of unspeakable horror. The bodies were scattered throughout, the blood staining the wooden floors, pooling in the corners. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence that the victims had fought or attempted to flee. They had been caught completely off guard. The rooms were dark, the air heavy with the weight of their deaths. Mary rushed to town to alert the authorities, her mind reeling from the sight she had just witnessed. By the time the sheriff arrived, the house had become a crime scene, its floorboards marked by blood and the unmistakable smell of death. No one had heard a thing. No neighbors had seen anyone enter or leave the house during the night. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs that the killer had been disturbed. It was as if the murderer had simply walked in, carried out the killings, and then vanished back into the night as if they had never been there at all. As the investigation began, it was clear that nothing about this murder was ordinary. The house was untouched by anything other than the blood of the victims. There were no valuables stolen, no signs of robbery. The weapon used, an axe, belonged to the Moore family, left in plain view near the bodies. The killer, it seemed, had been completely calm, methodical. They had left no clues, no trace of their identity, only the bodies. And as the days passed, the questions began to mount. Who could have committed such a horrific act? Why, how had they entered the house without disturbing anyone? And most haunting of all, who was the killer, watching when the final blow fell? As the investigation into the Villisca axe murders unfolded, the town of Villisca was left in a state of disbelief. The horror that had unfolded inside the Moore home felt too surreal, too unfathomable to grasp. With each passing day, the case grew more puzzling. The authorities, led by Sheriff Gus Folk, had no answers, no suspects. The town was on edge, and the fear that had once been confined to the shadows now seemed to walk openly among the people. The sheriff and his team of investigators scoured the Moore house repeatedly, each time hoping to find some small clue that would unravel the mystery, but the house yielded no answers. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no foreign items that didn't belong. The killer's identity remained elusive. It was as though the murderer had been invisible, a ghost who had slipped unnoticed through the town, leaving only destruction in their wake. Rumors began to swirl through Villisca. Whispers of a mysterious figure seen in the area in the days leading up to the murders. Some said they had seen a man with a hat and a long coat, his face obscured by the shadows. Others claimed they had noticed a strange figure lingering near the church the evening of the murders, but no one could say for sure who he was. It was the type of small-town gossip that made the air feel heavier, more oppressive. The fear that the killer might still be nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike again, kept people inside their homes long after the sun had set. Meanwhile, the authorities found themselves at a dead end. They had no physical evidence to work with, no real motive for the killings, and no leads to follow. It wasn't until they interviewed the people closest to the Moore family that things began to take an eerie turn. Joe Moore, the father of the family, had a history of running a local store, a place where he interacted with various people in the town. But there was little to suggest that anyone had any ill will toward him or his family. The Moore family had always been well liked, and their involvement in the church made them even more beloved in the small community. If there were any enemies, no one seemed to know who they might be. Yet the police discovered that just days before the murders, Joe had reportedly been approached by a man who seemed oddly insistent on speaking with him. The stranger was described as tall, with a weathered face, wearing a heavy coat despite the warm weather. He had been seen near Joe's store, asking questions that seemed insignificant at the time, where the Moore family lived, whether Joe had been to church recently, and if there were any upcoming events in town. The man was said to have lingered for longer than necessary. But when questioned, Joe dismissed the encounter as a strange but harmless one. The investigators turned their focus toward this strange man, but no one in the town could say for certain who he was. They checked with nearby towns and the surrounding area, but no one recognized him, and the trail quickly went cold. Then the unthinkable happened. The case took a dark, almost supernatural turn. One evening, just a few weeks after the murders, a local man named Frank Jones, who had been involved in a long-running business rivalry with Joe Moore, was found dead in his barn. The cause of death was listed as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. While the sheriff initially suspected foul play, an investigation concluded that Frank Jones had taken his own life. But something about the circumstances surrounding his death sent ripples of fear through the town. The timing was strange, and the eerie coincidence between Jones's death and the ongoing investigation into the Moore family murders felt too unsettling to ignore. Theories started to surface, with some suggesting that Jones's death was linked to the murders of the Moore family. A small faction of townsfolk believed that Joe Moore's rivalry with Jones could have led to the killings. But there was no concrete evidence to tie Jones to the crime scene, and his death only deepened the mystery. Still, whispers in the town grew louder. People began to speak of an ancient evil of curses that lingered in the earth, and of dark forces that had been unleashed long before the Moore family had arrived in Villisca. The town's elders recalled tales from their grandparents about a strange and malevolent presence in the land, an evil spirit that had haunted the area for generations. They spoke of old rituals meant to appease the spirit of warnings that had been ignored, and of people who had disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Some began to question whether the murders were the work of a human at all. Could it have been something else? Something darker? Could the killings be tied to the strange history of Villisca? The kind of history that no one wanted to acknowledge, but which still lingered like a shadow in the background. As time passed, the investigation stagnated, and the townspeople grew restless. The sense of dread that hung over Villisca was palpable. The air felt thicker, the nights longer. It seemed as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. People moved quietly through the streets, afraid to speak too openly about the murders, afraid of the curse that they had come to believe lingered in the town's soil. As summer bled into fall, the case grew colder. The Moore house was abandoned and left to rot and decay under the weight of its dark memories. But no one would venture inside. The townspeople believed the house was cursed, that the evil that had been done there would never leave. And so the years passed, and the mystery of the Villisca axe murders lingered unsolved. The town moved on, but it was never quite the same. A shadow had fallen over Villisca, one that could never be lifted, and though life continued in its sleepy rhythm, the fear remained. No one knew who had killed the Moore family, nor why, but the darkness of that night still haunted the people of Villisca, leaving them with only questions and an ever-deepening sense of dread. The ghosts of the Moore family, their faces frozen in terror, seemed to walk among the living, their presence felt in the whispered conversations of the townspeople. As long as the memories of that night remained so, too would the shadow of the murders stretching long and dark across the quiet streets of Villisca. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, the faint sound of an axe striking wood could still be heard in the distance. Story 3: The Elisa Lam Case. The Cecil Hotel stood quietly under the grey Los Angeles sky, an imposing structure that had once been the center of excitement and mystery in the heart of downtown. Its faded grandeur gave way to an unsettling sense of isolation. The buzzing of traffic and the laughter of pedestrians outside seemed distant, as if the hotel was tucked away in its own world, a world where time had stopped, and where the lives of those who came and went became whispers in the wind. Elisa Lam, a young woman from Canada, arrived at the Cecil on January 26, 2013. She had been traveling alone, hoping to explore the city and find a sense of freedom. She checked into the hotel, sharing a room with a couple of strangers, but her stay would soon take a darker turn. On the surface, Elisa was like any other young traveler, adventurous, curious, and eager to experience something new. She had been active on social media, posting photographs and updates from her trip, showing glimpses of herself, exploring different parts of the city, enjoying her time in the sun. She shared her thoughts with her followers, posting about the people she met, the places she visited, and the beauty she found in the chaotic streets of LA. But as the days wore on, something about Elisa began to change. The posts grew more sporadic, and the tone of her messages became increasingly erratic. By February 1st, Elisa's family began to worry. She hadn't returned their calls, and her communication had stopped altogether. Her parents, who had been following her journey from a distance, grew anxious when she failed to respond to their messages. They decided to contact the hotel, but they were met with no answers. When Elisa's roommates found that she was missing, they alerted the hotel management. A search was launched, and for days, the hotel staff combed through the premises. The search expanded beyond the hotel itself into the surrounding neighborhood, but there was no sign of Elisa. Her whereabouts remained a mystery. At first, it seemed as though she had simply wandered off, maybe taken a stroll through the city, or perhaps something had happened to her outside the hotel. But as time passed, the police grew concerned. Elisa's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a puzzle that demanded answers. Something had happened to her in the hotel, something no one could explain. On February 19th, after nearly 3 weeks of searching, a hotel worker named Santiago Lopez made a grim discovery. He was inspecting the water tanks on the roof of the Cecil when he noticed something strange. The lid to one of the tanks had been removed, and when he looked inside, he found the body of Elisa Lam. The discovery sent shockwaves through the hotel, but it was the circumstances of Elisa's death that truly unsettled everyone. The tank was over 10 feet tall, and the lid was heavy. It didn't seem possible that Elisa had climbed in there on her own. It was a baffling and horrifying scene. Elisa's body was found naked, her clothing discarded nearby, and the water in the tank was contaminated, discolored with her presence. The hotel guests who had been drinking and using the water were unaware, and the discovery would forever change the history of the Cecil Hotel. It wasn't just the mysterious location of the body that caused concern. There was something about Elisa's last moments that didn't make sense. Surveillance footage from the hotel's elevator provided an eerie glimpse of what might have transpired. The footage captured on January 31st showed Elisa entering the elevator on the hotel's 4th floor. Her movements were odd, jerky, and erratic. She pressed multiple buttons, but the elevator did not respond. Then she seemed to duck down into the corner of the elevator, glancing quickly back toward the hallway, as if she was being followed. She peered in and out of the doors, but no one else was visible. Her movements were frantic, desperate, as though something was chasing her, though there was no one in sight. Then, inexplicably, Elisa stepped out of the elevator. Her hands pressed to the walls and walked out of frame. The footage ended abruptly, leaving behind more questions than answers. What had caused Elisa to behave in such a frantic manner? Why had she entered the elevator and pressed multiple buttons, then acted as if someone or something was after her? As the video spread across the internet, people began to speculate. Some believed Elisa was experiencing a mental health crisis. Others wondered if drugs or something more sinister had played a role in her erratic behavior. But the most unsettling theories were those that suggested a darker, more supernatural cause. Some believed that Elisa had been followed, or even that the hotel itself had played a role in her death. The Cecil, after all, had a long history of strange occurrences, eerie events, and even a notorious reputation as a place where people checked in and never checked out. The hotel's dark history seemed to haunt the investigation. The Cecil Hotel had long been associated with tragedy, suicide, and mystery. Over the years, it had become infamous for the deaths and disappearances that occurred within its walls. There were reports of violent crimes, and in the 1980s, the hotel had even been home to Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker serial killer. The building's reputation only grew more sinister with time, and many of the hotel's residents came and went without a trace. Despite all the speculation, the official cause of Elisa's death was ruled as accidental drowning. But the circumstances surrounding her death remained shrouded in mystery. The bizarre behavior captured on the elevator footage, her strange disappearance, and the unsettling discovery of her body left too many unanswered questions. How had she ended up on the roof? Why had no one heard or seen her? How could she have ended up inside a water tank that was difficult to access? The haunting footage from the elevator continued to perplex people. As they watched, they wondered what it was that Elisa had seen or felt that had caused her to react so urgently. Some speculated that she was being pursued by something invisible, something dark and intangible that had been lurking within the walls of the hotel. Others believed that Elisa had stumbled upon something she was never meant to find, something that had been buried for decades. The Cecil Hotel, with its eerie, unsettling history, had left its mark on Elisa's life in ways no one could have predicted. And though her death was officially ruled an accident, the unanswered questions continued to haunt the people who came in contact with her story. But as the investigation waned, the supernatural theories persisted. Elisa's name became associated with the Cecil Hotel, and she became a symbol of the countless lost souls who had passed through its doors only to vanish without a trace. And in the end, as the memories of Elisa Lam's tragic death lingered in the shadows of the Cecil, the question remained what had truly happened to her. Was there something more lurking in the hotel than just its tragic past, something darker? Something that watched from the corners of the rooms waiting for its next victim. The mystery of Elisa Lam's death, though officially labeled as an accidental drowning, continued to haunt the Cecil Hotel. Rumors and theories swirled endlessly, consuming those who stumbled upon her tragic story. The elevator footage, with its erratic and unsettling images, had captivated the world's attention. But it also sparked something deeper, an obsession with the unknown. The media continued to replay the footage in looped segments, each time adding more context to the eerie movements Elisa made within the confines of the cramped elevator. Speculation about her state of mind ran rampant. Was she having a mental breakdown, or was she being manipulated by something unseen? An invisible force pressing her to act in such a strange, disjointed manner. A handful of viewers began to analyze the elevator footage, obsessively searching for hidden messages or signs of paranormal activity. As the theories deepened, so did the questions. While some dismissed the footage as the frantic actions of someone struggling with a mental illness, others couldn't shake the feeling that Elisa had been in the presence of something far more sinister. There were rumors that the hotel, with its long history of death, suicide, and violence, had more than its fair share of malevolent energy. Some wondered if Elisa had unknowingly stumbled into the hotel's darker side, a side that had been waiting for her all along. As the days passed, a chilling pattern emerged, one that seemed to center around the strange and inexplicable happenings that had occurred at the Cecil for decades. One of the most unnerving stories was that of the building's history with death. The Cecil had long been a place of tragedy, with multiple suicides, violent crimes, and disappearances. Several past residents, people lost and broken, had turned to the hotel for shelter. But for many, that shelter had become a tomb. One of the most famous and chilling figures associated with the hotel was Richard Ramirez, the notorious Night Stalker. Ramirez had stayed in the Cecil during his killing spree in the 1980s, and it was said that his presence left a permanent stain on the building. Others believed that his energy, twisted and dark, lingered in the hotel long after his arrest. Some even speculated that Ramirez's own malevolent force had influenced Elisa, pushing her into the elevator where she seemed to be trying to escape something unseen. Was it possible that Ramirez's energy had crossed paths with Elisa's in that ill-fated hotel? That his presence, coupled with the hotel's history, had created the perfect storm of terror? But it wasn't just Richard Ramirez that haunted the building. The Cecil had a history of strange deaths dating back to its construction in the 1920s. The hotel had once been a haven for the destitute, a place for those on the fringes of society. Many who came to stay never left their stories lost to the passing years. In fact, the hotel had become notorious for its high number of suicides. In 1962, a woman jumped to her death from the 9th floor, her body landing on a pedestrian below. In 2013, Elisa Lam's own death would add yet another tragic chapter to this grim history. As the rumors surrounding Elisa's death grew, so did the idea that the Cecil Hotel itself was cursed, a place that lured in the lost and broken and never let them go. Those who believed in the supernatural spoke of spirits, trapped souls wandering the hotel, unable to find peace. They whispered about the restless entities that seemed to thrive in the building's dark corners, unseen and waiting for the next victim. The hotel staff, meanwhile, remained tight-lipped. The management seemed to do their best to keep the dark history of the Cecil out of the public eye, focusing instead on the hotel's renovations and the efforts to distance it from its grim reputation. They claimed to have no knowledge of Elisa Lam's final moments, and yet the unsettling rumors about the hotel persisted. Was there something more sinister at play? Had Elisa's tragic end been the result of something supernatural? Or was it simply the culmination of a troubled life? A lonely woman in a city that had swallowed her up. A number of online theorists began digging deeper into Elisa's life, scrutinizing her social media presence, old blog posts, and interactions with others. What they found was a woman who appeared outwardly cheerful, but whose personal reflections suggested an underlying struggle. Elisa had spoken about her battles with mental health, her desire to connect with others, and her desire to fit in. But there were also moments of dark introspection, fleeting thoughts about loneliness and disconnection. Some suggested that Elisa may have been suffering from a condition called dissociative identity disorder, which could explain her erratic behavior in the elevator. Others speculated that Elisa had suffered a psychotic break brought on by the stress of traveling alone, or possibly by some unknown factor in the hotel itself. Could something about the environment, the isolation, the strange energy that seemed to pulse through the Cecil have exacerbated her mental health struggles? And if so, was there an element of the hotel's dark history that had triggered this breakdown? More disturbing was the possibility that Elisa's death was not simply an accident, but something darker at play. Could she have encountered something in the hotel? Something supernatural, something that drove her to her death? The idea that Elisa's death had been orchestrated by a malevolent force was not easily dismissed by some of the more vocal theorists. They believed that Elisa's behavior in the elevator, her frantic gestures and strange movements, were evidence of something she could not control. Perhaps she had been trying to escape the influence of whatever haunted the hotel. As the months passed, the story of Elisa Lam continued to captivate the public, with new developments sparking even more questions. Theories continued to evolve, and new footage was unearthed from nearby security cameras that seemed to show a shadowy figure lurking in the background of the elevator scene. Could this be evidence of another presence? Something or someone was watching her, and the unsettling feeling that something had been manipulating her only deepened. The most chilling part of the mystery was the uncertainty that hung over Elisa's final moments. Was she alone when she climbed into that water tank? Was she being chased? The silence of the hotel, the stillness that seemed to consume everything around her, left a haunting void in the investigation. By the time the case had gone cold, Elisa Lam had become more than a missing person. She had become a symbol of the eerie, unexplainable, a tragic figure trapped in the web of the Cecil Hotel's twisted history. Her face, once vibrant with youthful energy, was now frozen in time. Her tragic end replayed endlessly across the internet as countless viewers and conspiracy theorists continued to search for answers. The Cecil Hotel, long known for its dark history, had witnessed another death, one that would linger in the minds of those who stumbled upon the story for years to come. The presence that had seemed to haunt the hotel, the energy that had become a part of its very fabric, was still there, still waiting in the darkness, unseen and waiting for the next story to unfold. And for Elisa Lam, whose final moments were captured in an elevator that seemed to trap her between worlds, the question still lingered. What was it that followed her? What unseen force had watched her every step, and why had it chosen her? Her name became a whisper in the halls of the Cecil, carried by the winds of mystery, forever tied to the dark, forgotten corners of the City of Angels. Story 4. The Smiley Face Killers. It had been a quiet night, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was cool, with a slight mist rising from the river that snaked through the city's heart. Streets were empty save for the occasional car, its headlights slicing through the darkness. To the casual observer, it would have appeared as an ordinary evening in the city. Nothing to suggest that something was waiting. Something that had been waiting for a long time. Evan Matthews was walking home from his usual late-night shift at the diner. The sidewalk was nearly deserted, the neon signs casting a dull glow on the rain-slick pavement. He adjusted his jacket, pulling it tighter around him as he walked. His footsteps echoed in the quiet streets, a rhythmic sound that was somehow comforting. He had worked late again, but that wasn't unusual. Most nights he enjoyed the solitude, the peace of the world, when it felt like everyone else had gone to sleep. But tonight was different. Tonight there was an odd sense of being watched, a sensation that prickled at the back of his neck. He quickened his pace, glancing around as the shadows grew longer in the streetlight's dim glow. There was nothing unusual, just the familiar outlines of the buildings, the soft hum of the city at rest. Yet something unsettled him. A strange instinct, one he couldn't ignore, nudged him forward, urging him to keep moving. His apartment wasn't far. He'd be home soon. That was when he saw it. At first it seemed like nothing. A flicker of light, barely perceptible, just a flash in the corner of his vision. He turned his head, but there was no one there. Just the street ahead, dark and still. Then another flash, this time more deliberate. A faint glimmer, as though someone was standing just out of view, watching him. Evan hesitated. He wasn't the paranoid type. He lived in a city where late-night walks were a regular thing, and he had never felt out of place. But tonight, something felt wrong. It wasn't the shadowy figure lurking in the alley. It wasn't the fleeting sense of a presence just beyond his reach. It was the symbol. That faint image that caught his eye and wouldn't let go. A smiley face painted on the brick wall of the alley he was passing. It wasn't a smiley face in the cheerful, innocent sense. This one was grotesque. Its lines were jagged, uneven, like someone's last attempt at a smile before the hand had trembled from exhaustion or fear. The eyes were wide blank, with no life behind them. The mouth was twisted, the edges curling up into something unnatural. Evan stared at it for a moment, confused. How had he not noticed it before? Was it new, or had it always been there, just waiting for him to see it? The hairs on his neck stood on end. His instinct screamed at him to keep walking, but something rooted him to the spot. He glanced over his shoulder, but the street was empty. He turned back to the wall. The smiley face was still there, but it had somehow grown darker. The paint now seemed fresh, glistening and ominous. A message, perhaps. A warning. Without thinking, Evan stepped closer. Drawn toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. His breath hitched as the figure in the shadows seemed to move. But there was no one there. Evan stopped. His pulse raced. The hair on his arms prickled. And then, as if on cue, the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was something deeper. Something that gnawed at his mind. A cold, creeping feeling that made him question every shadow, every corner. The air shifted, growing colder, and for a split second, the sound of distant laughter echoed through the alley. Evan froze, his heart thudding against his ribs. It wasn't a real laugh, not a joyful one. It was hollow, echoing. Something wasn't right, and then the city's hum seemed to fade. The street lights flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. His breath grew shallow as he turned to leave, a surge of urgency pushing him forward. But before he could make it 2 steps, a sound rang out, a scraping noise. The scrape of metal on stone. Evan spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. But the alley was empty save for the dark, lifeless, smiley face on the wall. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced. The scraping sound had come from behind him. He could feel it. The movement of air, the presence of something too close to him. He looked over his shoulder again, but no one was there. The laughter came again, this time louder, closer, as if it was right behind him. A voice whispered in the dark, too faint to understand. The sound of something being dragged across the ground. Evan's legs trembled and panic seized him. His breathing became erratic. He had to leave, had to get out of the alley. The smiley face seemed to grow darker still. Its jagged mouth now appeared to be grinning, its painted eyes staring at him unblinking, as if knowing what was coming. Evan turned and ran. His feet pounded against the wet pavement, his breath ragged. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. The alley stretched on, but the walls felt like they were closing in. The darkened streets seemed to swallow him whole, and the coldness of the air, that feeling of being watched, pressed against his chest with each step. His footsteps echoed as he made his way toward the end of the alley, but they were drowned out by the sudden sound of footsteps behind him. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close. Evan's chest tightened. His heart seemed to stop. He whipped around, his eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing but the laughter. It was louder now, maddening, spiraling into something uncontrollable. Evan's mind raced. Was it a trick? His own fear playing tricks on him. He couldn't be sure. He couldn't be sure of anything anymore. The figure that had been following him, the one whose footsteps echoed with his own, was still there. It was there, but it wasn't. It was a shadow, a phantom, lurking at the edges of his vision. Every time he looked, it seemed to be just a little farther away. It wasn't a man, not exactly. The smile, the same grotesque, distorted, smiley face, appeared again, this time scrawled on the pavement before him. He hadn't seen it there moments ago. Had it appeared out of thin air? It was the same smile, the same twisted grin, but now it seemed to be watching him, knowing exactly what he feared. The scraping noise came again, followed by the distant sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Then the laughter rose once more, becoming louder, clearer until it filled every corner of his mind. Evan had no choice. He had to run. He turned and fled down the alley, the weight of his own fear driving him forward. But with every step, he heard the sound behind him. The scrape of metal on stone. The laughter. The unblinking, ever-watchful eyes. The smiley face killers were out there. They were real, and they were waiting for him. Evan's legs burned as he pushed himself faster. The relentless sound of footsteps behind him growing louder, closer. He didn't dare look back. The laughter echoed through the alley, bouncing off the damp brick walls, disorienting him. His breath came in ragged gasps, a steady rhythm of panic and exhaustion. But every time he thought he might escape the sound of dragging metal like chains scraping against concrete followed him, as though the thing pursuing him was gaining. The alley seemed endless now, stretching before him like a dark void. Shadows swirled in the corners of his vision, flitting from wall to wall. The streetlights overhead flickered erratically, casting the scene in a harsh, stuttering light. Each flicker made the darkness feel thicker, the air heavier, as if something was feeding off his fear. His mind raced, desperate for an explanation, for any logic to latch onto. The smiley face, the scraping noise, the disembodied laughter. None of it made sense. Could this all be in his head? Could he have imagined it all but know his pulse, his panicked breath, the feeling of something closing in it was all too real? He turned the corner, hoping for a break, a way out, but the alley had swallowed him whole. He wasn't sure how far he had run, but it felt like the street had become a labyrinth. The walls pressed in on him, the air growing thick with a suffocating weight. The city around him had vanished. There was nothing but this dark, twisting tunnel, and the thing that stalked him from the shadows. Suddenly, the scraping noise stopped. The laughter too. For a brief moment, there was only the sound of his own heavy breathing, the pounding of his heart in his chest. Evan slowed his pace, confused. He dared to glance over his shoulder, but the alley was empty. His mind screamed at him to keep running, but the sudden silence was just as unnerving as the sound had been. He stood frozen for a moment, eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the silence that enveloped him. The feeling of being watched, however, didn't fade. It only grew stronger. His skin prickled with the sensation that something was lurking in the dark spaces around him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw it again, the smiley face. It wasn't painted on the brick wall this time. It was on the ground, etched into the concrete beneath his feet. The same jagged, twisted grin, the same hollow eyes staring up at him. It was freshly drawn, as if someone had just left it there for him to find. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He took a step backward, eyes locked on the face, as if it might come to life and speak to him. The laughter returned louder now, echoing all around him, though he could see no one. It was as if the very air itself was alive with it. His breathing quickened again, panic rising in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to turn and run, but the ground beneath his feet felt like quicksand. The smile seemed to be growing, expanding, as if it were pulling him in. The scraping sound came again, followed by the low, guttural whisper of something moving through the shadows. Evan spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing there. The alley had swallowed him whole, the light dimming further, as though something was cutting off his escape. His mind raced. He tried to think, tried to remember something, anything that could explain this. The smiley face killers that name it rang a bell in his mind. A series of drownings, unexplained deaths. Young men found dead in rivers or lakes, their bodies discarded, with eerie symbols carved near the scene. It was a rumor, a legend, nothing more, nothing less. Right, but as the noise grew louder, as the shadows twisted and contorted around him, Evan felt the creeping realization sink in. This wasn't just a legend. This was real. And he was in the midst of it. He had to get out. Without thinking, Evan bolted his legs, moving on instinct, pumping harder than ever before. He raced down the alley, not daring to look behind him. His feet hit the pavement with a frantic rhythm, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed himself faster. The city felt far away now. All that existed was the alley and the fear clawing at him. The scraping sound followed him, relentless, as if whatever it was had latched onto him, feeding off his terror. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. He had to escape, had to find a way out of this nightmare. As he rounded another corner, he saw a flicker of light dim far off, but it was something. It had to be something. The street, the real world. It was just beyond this darkness. He pushed forward, each step an effort, each breath a struggle, and then the ground gave way beneath him. Evan tumbled into the street, his body slamming into the pavement, his vision spinning as he tried to catch his breath. His hands scraped across the cold concrete as he pulled himself up, pain lancing through his legs. He looked up. The street before him was quiet, the lights of a nearby building flickering in the distance. He could see the city again, the familiar outlines of the buildings, the hum of cars on the road, but the sensation of being watched never left. He stood shakily, glancing back toward the alley. There was nothing now. No figures, no shadows, no more sound of scraping metal. Just the cold wind blowing through the empty street. He took a deep breath, his legs trembling beneath him. He had to leave. He had to get to safety. He looked toward the distant lights and started walking, his footsteps slow and uncertain. But as he passed the alley's mouth, something stopped him. A voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the night. "Smile." The word hung in the air, thick with malice, as if the very atmosphere around him had shifted. He froze in place, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of footsteps, the same dragging, scraping sound, came from behind him. His body went cold, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. His heart hammered in his chest as the laughter came again, not from the distance this time, but from just behind him. It was low and guttural, like something crawling up from the depths of the earth. He turned slowly, his eyes wide, the smiley face appearing once more in the shadows. This time it wasn't just painted on a wall. It was in the air, in the darkness itself, and Evan realized then, with a horrifying clarity, that the smiley face killers were never just a group. They were something older, something that had always been watching, waiting in the shadows. And now they were here, they were real, and they were smiling. Story 5. The Disappearance of the Sodder Children. It was the night before Christmas, 1945, and the Sodder family had just finished their holiday meal in the warmth of their home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The tree stood proudly in the corner, its ornaments twinkling faintly in the low light, casting long shadows across the room. The children, 5 of them, ranging from the oldest Marion to the youngest Sylvia, had spent the evening playing, laughing, and singing Christmas carols. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickering shadows up the walls. The Sodders were a family who had always been close-knit, their lives centered around one another. George and Jenny Sodder were hard-working and devoted parents, and their children filled the house with energy and light. But that night, after the celebration had died down, a sense of unease settled over the family, though no one could pinpoint exactly why. It had been a long year. The Second World War had ended, and though there was relief, there was also an undercurrent of lingering grief, loss, and confusion. Everyone seemed to be adjusting to the changes, but deep down, there was something unsettling in the air. It was almost as if the night itself had become heavy-weighted with expectations and unspoken fears. After the children had gone to bed, George and Jenny, both in their late 40s, sat quietly together in the dimly lit living room, occasionally glancing toward the staircase that led up to the children's rooms. Marion, the eldest, had stayed up later than usual, reading by the light of her bedside lamp. It had been a tiring year, but Christmas had been a bright spot. They had all come together until that moment. Around 10:30, as George sat in his chair, his eyes drifting closed, from the warmth of the fire, he thought he heard something strange. A faint rustling, followed by the sound of something heavy, like the scraping of metal on stone. He couldn't be sure. It was so faint, easily mistaken for the wind or the house settling, but it caught his attention nonetheless. Jenny, noticing his unease, looked up from her knitting. "Did you hear that?" she asked softly, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the window. George nodded slowly. "Could be the wind," he said, though he wasn't convinced. The wind did often whistle through the trees in the backyard, especially when it was cold. But there was something off about it tonight. Something that didn't sit right. The house was quiet, too quiet for a winter night. Before either of them could say anything more, the phone rang. It was odd at this hour, and neither of them knew who would be calling. George picked up the receiver, his hand shaking slightly as he raised it to his ear. "Hello?" he asked, his voice low. The line crackled before a voice on the other end spoke, a man, but not someone they recognized. He asked if they had seen the lights on the hill. "We've been seeing them all evening," the voice said. "Strange lights on the hill by your property. You might want to check it out." George frowned, a chill creeping down his spine. The hill had always been a dark, foreboding place, to him a place he avoided after dark. It was hard to explain why, but the hill had always felt wrong. The land on the other side of the ridge felt empty and abandoned. There were stories, whispered rumors of strange happenings in the area. But George dismissed them as superstition, a way to explain things that couldn't be explained. "I'll have a look," George replied curtly, his voice tight. Jenny stood up, her brow furrowed with concern. "George, don't go out there. It's late. It's freezing outside." But George, being a man of action, had already decided. "Stay here. I'll be quick." He hung up the phone and grabbed his coat. Outside, the cold night air bit at his face. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the backyard, toward the hill where the strange lights had supposedly been seen. He didn't want to believe the stories he had heard growing up, but now walking through the darkened yard, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He made his way slowly up the incline, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The lights were faint at first, distant, flickering in the darkness. They moved erratically, as though something or someone was moving between the trees, casting strange shadows. But as he reached the top of the hill, the lights suddenly vanished, leaving the night still and silent. George stood there for a long moment, staring into the blackness. There was no movement, no sound, only the eerie quiet of the winter night. He turned back toward the house, uneasy. Something about this felt wrong, but he couldn't explain why. He returned to the house just after midnight, but the sense of unease lingered. He found Jenny still sitting by the fire, staring at the empty staircase. The warmth of the fire did little to lift the chill that had settled in the room. "Did you see anything?" Jenny asked quietly. "No," George replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Nothing," but as he spoke, he realized the strange feeling had grown stronger. He couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. The night dragged on, and George finally went to bed. Jenny too tried to sleep, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange lights and the phone call. She had never heard of such things in their small town before, nothing like this. There were always rumors about the supernatural, but it was never more than whispered talk. Still, something felt different this time. Around 100 a.m., Jenny awoke with a start. Something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet, quieter than it had ever been. She glanced toward the children's rooms upstairs. They should be sleeping, but there was no sound coming from their rooms. It was too quiet. The tension in the house was palpable, as though something had shifted, as if the house had begun to breathe differently. She heard a faint creaking sound, a door opening. But it wasn't the children. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper within the house. She stood up, her heart racing in her chest. She moved slowly toward the staircase, her steps cautious, as if afraid to disturb the silence. The creaking sound grew louder, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from above. Jenny's breath caught in her throat. The children's rooms were at the top of the stairs. She reached the first step and froze. The footsteps stopped. Suddenly she heard a faint thump, then another. It came from the attic. Jenny's blood ran cold. The attic was always locked. No one went up there. Yet the sound continued. It was a low, muffled sound, like something or someone was moving around up there. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the house pressing in on her, its walls growing closer with each passing second. Something was in the attic. Something had been waiting. Jenny stood frozen at the base of the stairs, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The house seemed to hold its breath, with her the silence growing deeper, thicker, as though something unseen was waiting just beyond her reach. The muffled thumps from above continued, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was making its way across the attic floor. It was a sound she had never heard before, and it filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She should have gone for help, called someone, anyone, but her feet wouldn't move. Her body refused to obey, as if bound by invisible chains. The attic door, always locked and sealed shut, had become a looming presence in the darkness above. What was up there, and why now, on this night when everything was supposed to be peaceful? The house had always been old, but it had never felt like this before. It had always been a home full of love and laughter, even with the occasional creak of the floorboards or the sound of wind rattling the windows. But tonight, everything was different. It felt as though the very air had shifted, as though something had awakened from within the walls, something old and restless. Jenny's mind raced a dozen thoughts colliding at once. Could it have been a mouse? An animal in the attic? But the thumps were too deliberate, too precise, like footsteps. She took a step forward slowly, cautiously. Her hand rested on the railing of the stairs, gripping it for support, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. She was a mother, a wife. She had dealt with so much already. But this was different. This was something she couldn't explain. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound returned. This time, it was louder, more distinct, closer. Jenny could feel it in her chest, vibrating with every step. Her heart raced as the sound came closer and closer to the door at the top of the stairs. Without thinking, Jenny ran. She fled up the stairs, her feet pounding against the wood, her breath ragged. The children's rooms, her children, were just a few steps away. But the door at the top of the stairs loomed like a dark, impenetrable wall. She reached it in seconds, but something stopped her. The door to the attic was cracked open. For a long moment, Jenny stood in front of it, her hand hovering just above the handle. She wanted to call out to her children to make sure they were okay, but something kept her rooted in place. It was as if the air itself was holding her back. And then she heard it again, a voice, a soft whisper, almost inaudible, coming from the darkness behind the attic door. Jenny's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but there was something in it, a feeling, an echo that made her skin crawl. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It wasn't any of her children. It was someone else. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open, a faint creak echoing through the quiet hallway. The attic was dark, its shadows hanging heavy in the corners, but Jenny could make out something in the center of the room. There, standing in the middle of the attic, was a figure. Its back was turned toward her, but the faint outline of a person, tall, thin, and wearing dark clothing, stood motionless as though waiting for her. "Who's there?" Jenny's voice cracked as she spoke, but it barely rose above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there. Fear gripped Jenny's heart as she stepped forward, her legs shaking. The figure didn't move, but there was a sense of malevolence in the air, an oppressive weight that seemed to press against her chest with every step. As she neared it, she felt a sudden chill, colder than anything she had ever experienced. It felt like the temperature in the attic had dropped, like the very atmosphere had shifted into something dark and unnatural. "Who are you?" Jenny asked again, her voice trembling. But the figure still didn't move. She was almost close enough to reach out and touch it when suddenly it turned. The face that met her gaze was not human. It was a hollow, ghostly mask with eyes wide and empty, as if there was nothing behind them. Its lips curled into a grotesque smile, a twisted grin that stretched unnaturally wide. It was not a smile of joy, but a smile of something far darker. It was a smile of death. Jenny stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as terror flooded her body. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. The figure stepped toward her, its movements slow but deliberate. Every step it took seemed to echo through the attic, and with each step the coldness grew. Without thinking, Jenny turned and ran. She fled down the stairs, her feet slipping as she descended in a frenzy. The figure's presence was still there. In the back of her mind, its smile burned into her memory. She had to get to her children. She had to make sure they were safe. She burst into the hallway where the children's rooms lay. Her breath ragged, her mind spinning. But when she reached the rooms, her heart sank. The doors to their bedrooms were ajar. She pushed the doors open, her eyes frantically scanning the rooms. They were empty. No one was there. Her pulse raced as panic set in. The beds were untouched, the sheets neatly folded, but her children, her 5 children, were gone. A scream rose in her throat, but it died before it could escape. Instead, the silence of the house seemed to suffocate her. The coldness that had consumed the attic was now all around her, thick in the air. The smile, the figure, the whispering voice, it all seemed to close in on her. Jenny stumbled backward, her mind racing. Where had they gone? How could they have disappeared so suddenly? Had they been taken? Was it the same figure from the attic? Then she heard it. A faint sound, a rustling, coming from the direction of the basement. It was so soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Jenny's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the stairs that led to the basement. The door at the bottom of the stairs was cracked open. Just a sliver of darkness on the other side. Something was down there. Something was waiting. With trembling hands, Jenny stepped toward the basement door, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step seemed to draw her deeper into the dark, into the unknown. The house, which had once been a place of safety and love, had become something else entirely. It had become a prison, a place where something ancient and dark had awakened. And as Jenny reached for the door, she knew whatever had taken her children, whatever had invaded their home, was waiting for her too, and it would never let them go. Story 6: The Watcher. The house on Boulevard Avenue stood tall, its sharp, angular edges casting long shadows under the flickering streetlights. Newly renovated, the facade gleamed with fresh paint, the windows reflecting the quiet suburban neighborhood. To anyone passing by, it seemed like the perfect home, a safe place to start anew. Yet to Derek and Maria Brannock, who had recently moved in, the house felt heavy with an unshakable sense of unease. They had come to this small town in New Jersey in search of peace, far from the noise of the city, hoping to raise their 3 children in a quieter, safer environment. The house, with its sprawling yard and modern amenities, seemed like a dream come true. Derek had always been the practical one, focused on ensuring his family had everything they needed. Maria, on the other hand, was the more sentimental one, nostalgic about the idea of a home that felt truly like home. They both believed that they had found that place. The first few weeks were blissful. The kids quickly made friends with the neighbors. The house seemed to settle into their routines, and the sound of laughter filled the rooms. But then, one afternoon, as Maria was sorting through boxes in the attic, she found something odd. A letter, tucked beneath a stack of old papers. It was handwritten on a yellowed sheet of paper. The ink faded, but still legible. "Dearest new neighbor," it began. "Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. I am the Watcher, and I have been watching this house for as long as I can remember. I have seen you and your family move in. I am pleased that you have taken residence here, but know this: nothing remains secret for long. Everything is being watched. Everything. You have no idea the things I know about you and your family. I know your routines. your habits, the children you protect. I see you every night through the windows. You are not safe here." Maria's fingers trembled as she held the letter, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. It was addressed to them, but who had written it? Who could have been watching them? The letter gave no name, no clear indication of who the sender might be. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as the work of an overly curious neighbor, perhaps someone with a bit too much time on their hands. But the words lingered in her mind, creeping into her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't shake. That evening, after the children were in bed, Maria showed Derek the letter. He read it quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's probably just a prank," he said, handing the paper back to her. "People get weird about new neighbors. We've got to let this go." But Maria wasn't so sure. The letter had unsettled her. She found herself looking out the windows more often, as if expecting to catch someone watching. And it wasn't just the letter. There were other signs, small things that didn't quite add up. She'd hear the creak of floorboards at night, a faint whisper of movement, though the house was empty. Occasionally, she'd feel a cold draft, even when the windows were closed. The following week, Maria noticed something even more disturbing. One of their neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Glover, came over to drop off some cookies. As they chatted on the porch, Mrs. Glover's gaze drifted up to the second floor of the house. She stared at it for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, as if she recognized something. Maria followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "Strange place, this house," Mrs. Glover said softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "Been here a while. I've seen a lot of things in this neighborhood. Seen people come and go." Her voice faltered. Then she quickly added, "But I'm sure you'll be fine. It's just an old house with old memories. Nothing more." Maria smiled politely, but inside a chill ran down her spine. Mrs. Glover's words seemed like an odd, cryptic warning. That night, Maria mentioned it to Derek, but he dismissed it. "It's just an old lady's ramblings. Don't let it get to you." Maria tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She found herself glancing out the windows at odd hours, checking the locks on the doors, even hearing the sounds of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. The atmosphere in the house began to feel oppressive, the walls closing in on her, whispering a strange sense of threat that she couldn't ignore. A week after the first letter, another one arrived. It was waiting for them in the mailbox, sealed in an envelope with no return address, just a simple scrawl on the front for the Brannocks. Derek opened it quickly, as though the letter might hold some explanation, some reassurance that it was just another prank. "Can't stop looking, can you? I'm still watching. I see you all every moment. The way you walk, the way you talk, the way your children sleep. All of it, all of you. I am the watcher, and I'll be watching you until you leave. I know everything." Derek's hand shook slightly as he put the letter down on the kitchen table. This time the words were more chilling, more pointed, as if the sender was growing bolder. He looked at Maria, his face pale, his jaw clenched. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "We need to report this to the police." But Maria, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her, didn't immediately agree. "Maybe we should just leave," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Maybe we're not meant to stay here." Derek stood up quickly, pacing around the kitchen. "No, we're not running from this. We've worked too hard for this house. But we need to do something. Something more than just reading these letters. The following days were tense. Derek installed security cameras around the property, checked every door and window for signs of forced entry, but found nothing. The police were no help either. They treated the letters like a prank, albeit an unsettling one, but nothing more. The watcher, it seemed, was a shadow that couldn't be pinned down, a name that held no substance. Maria, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was happening. She began researching the history of the house, the land it sat on. She pored over old maps of the neighborhood, looking for clues. And then late one night, she came across something that sent a chill through her entire body. The house they had bought once belonged to a family that had disappeared without a trace in the 1920s. The names had faded into obscurity, but the rumors were still alive, whispered in the streets for decades. They had been a well-to-do family, wealthy and respected, but they had vanished overnight, leaving behind only their belongings, their food half-eaten, and a strange note left on the kitchen table. The note simply read, "The Watcher will come." Maria's hands trembled as she read the words. She knew then that the Watcher had been here long before them, and now it was watching them. The discovery of the old family's disappearance only deepened the unease that had been growing inside Maria. The note left behind by the previous owners echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that whatever was happening to them wasn't new, it was part of a long, unsettling history. The Watcher had been watching long before they ever stepped foot in the house. Maria couldn't sleep that night. The sound of the wind howling outside only amplified the silence of the house, and she found herself listening to every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper in the shadows. It was as though the house had become alive, breathing and shifting in the dark. Derek had gone to bed early, exhausted from the stress of the past few days. But Maria remained wide awake, staring into the dark corners of their bedroom. She could feel it, the presence, the oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the smiley face, the grotesque, twisted grin etched into her thoughts like a brand. Then around 2:30 a.m., something shifted in the air. She could hear the faintest sound, a tap, tap, tap. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but it was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was gently tapping on the window. Her heart leapt into her throat. She held her breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. She slowly rose from the bed, her feet cold against the hardwood floor. The house was so quiet now, and the tapping was the only sound that filled the space. Maria walked cautiously toward the window, her hands trembling as she reached for the blinds. She pulled them aside, her breath caught in her throat. Nothing. The street outside was empty, as still as it had been when they first moved in. The dim glow of the streetlights barely cut through the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows along the pavement. Maria's heartbeat slowed. Perhaps it had just been her imagination. She was on edge, and the house was filled with the echoes of things unsaid. But just as she turned to step away from the window, the tapping came again. Louder this time. She froze, her blood running cold. The sound wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from inside the house. Her breath caught in her chest. The air felt thick, oppressive. Slowly she turned toward the door, her legs heavy with dread. The hallway outside her bedroom was dark, the shadows seeming to stretch farther than they should. She could hear it now, the faint shuffle of footsteps moving in and out of the rooms. Her mind raced, her pulse quickening. She knew Derek was asleep, but could he hear it too? Should she wake him? But what if it wasn't just a noise? What if someone was here? Her feet felt glued to the floor, her instincts screaming at her to move, to run. But she couldn't bring herself to. Instead, she stepped out into the hallway. The sound of her breath, the only thing she could hear. The footsteps came again, louder this time, closer, as if someone was moving through the rooms right next to her. Maria's throat tightened, her fingers curling into fists. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her ears, and froze as she reached the living room. There, standing in the center of the room, was a figure. A shadow in the dim light, tall and thin, wearing a long coat. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but Maria could feel its presence. She could feel the eyes that were watching her, studying her every movement. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still as if waiting. Maria's body went cold, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Maria blinked, and it was as if it had never been there at all. The room was empty, the shadows cast by the streetlights once again stretching across the walls. Maria stumbled back into the hallway, her mind spinning, her heart racing. Had she imagined it? Could it have been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon? She didn't know. She didn't want to know. But then another tap came. This time it was coming from upstairs. Maria's stomach twisted. She felt her legs move on their own, carrying her up the stairs, her mind screaming for her to stop, to turn back. But she couldn't. The pull was too strong, too insistent. She had to see what was happening. The sound of footsteps on the second floor was louder now. They moved through the rooms, pausing, then starting again. The door to the children's rooms was slightly ajar, but the rooms were empty. The beds, neatly made, were untouched. But the air was colder now, colder than it had been in the hallway. The walls seemed to hum with tension, as if the house itself was alive and aware of her presence. Maria walked down the hall to the attic door. It was closed, but something made her reach for the knob. She didn't know why. It was as though some force beyond her control was urging her to open it. She hesitated, her hand trembling, but then turned the handle. The door creaked open, the sound echoing in the quiet house. The attic was dark, the air stale with the smell of dust and forgotten memories. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it. The smiley face. It was painted on the wall. Not in paint, not in ink, but in something that looked darker, more sinister. The shape was familiar, the grotesque, twisted smile. It was smeared across the wood, like someone had used their own fingers to draw it. Maria stepped back, her blood running cold. Who had done this? She turned to leave, but then she heard it again, the scraping, the sound of metal on wood. It was coming from the corner of the attic. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned to face it. There in the corner was a box. It looked old, covered in dust, as though it had been hidden there for years. But the scraping sound, it was coming from inside. Maria's hand shook as she reached for the box, her mind fighting against the urge to pull away. Something was telling her to stop, to run, but she opened it anyway. Inside was a pile of old letters, each one stained with age, each one marked with the same twisted smiley face. The words on the letters were blurred, faded, but the message was clear. The Watcher has always been here. The air in the attic grew colder still, as if the very house was holding its breath. Maria could feel the presence behind her, feel the eyes on her once again. And the scraping sound, ever so faint, began again. Slowly, quietly, Maria turned around. She didn't need to look to know what was standing there. The figure, the Watcher, and now it had been waiting for her.